down now! The voice hits the hallway like a gunshot as David Rick is slammed harder into the floor, his face pressed against cold wood while a knee pins his spine. Federal agents swarm the narrow apartment, boots shaking the walls, papers flying as his open laptop flashes classified procurement files in the background, still logged in, still exposed. David Rick, 42, senior federal procurement auditor, doesn't fight. He just keeps repeating, strained but controlled, that they have the wrong man, that this is a federal audit case, not a criminal arrest. But nobody is listening. Outside the room, Officer Daniel Hayes stands still longer than the rest. Unlike the others, he isn't shouting or pushing forward. He's watching the paperwork being typed in real time. No warrant number, no federal transfer code, nothing properly authorized. That's when Lieutenant Brad Coleman steps in, takes one look at Marcus's credentials, and calmly says, "Process him anyway." Hayes turns his head slightly, just enough to see something being stamped into the system with a timestamp that doesn't match reality. And then his radio crackles with a voice that shouldn't be there at all. "We're proceeding. Do not interfere." Hayes freezes. Because that wasn't an order, it was a confirmation. And David, still pinned to the ground, suddenly looks straight at him, like he already knows why he's really here. Before we go anywhere further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. "David, look at me, stay still." The words cut through the chaos, but they don't come from an officer holding him down. They come from Officer Daniel Hayes. For the first time since the raid began, someone in the room isn't acting on instinct or aggression. Hayes is crouched near the edge of the hallway, eyes locked on Marcus. No, David Rick like he's trying to piece together something that doesn't fit. Around them, the apartment is still shaking with movement. Agents are tearing through drawers, flipping over documents, scanning Marcus's workstation like they already know what they're supposed to find. Or, more importantly, what they're supposed to ignore. Hayes glances again at the arrest intake screen on a portable device. His jaw tightens. No valid warrant number. No federal judge authorization. And the emergency procurement threat designation attached to David's name, it was entered less than 10 minutes before the team arrived. That shouldn't be possible. Inside the room, Lieutenant Brad Coleman steps closer to David's pinned body, finally lowering his voice as if that makes it legal. "You've been flagged for interference in a federal matter. That's all you need to know." David lifts his head slightly, struggling against the pressure on his back. "I audit federal contracts. That's my job. I don't interfere. I expose corruption." A pause. Just 1 second. And that's when Hayes sees it, something on the laptop screen still flickering behind the chaos. Payment logs, vendor codes, federal procurement chains he recognizes but was never supposed to question. His expression changes. Not confusion anymore. Recognition. And then Hayes reaches slowly for his radio, but stops halfway when Coleman turns his head toward him without even looking directly. "You don't want to get involved in this," Coleman says quietly. And in that moment, Hayes realizes this arrest isn't about David Rick at all. It's about what David already uncovered and who is trying to make sure it never leaves this room. Hayes slowly straightens, but he doesn't take his eyes off the screen in front of him. A new update flashes across the system. Case status: federal high threat detention active, but beneath it, in a smaller line that shouldn't be visible at all, something else appears for half a second before it refreshes. Authority source: unverified internal override. Hayes feels his stomach tighten. That doesn't just mean something is wrong. It means someone inside the system is actively rewriting reality in real time. Behind him, David strains against the pressure on his back again, his voice lower now, more controlled, like he's trying to reach the only person in the room who hasn't fully decided who he is yet. "You're not here for me," David says. "You're here because of what I found." Hayes doesn't respond, because now he sees it too clearly. Procurement audit files still open on the laptop. Millions in federal contracts routed through shell vendors, names tied directly to enforcement suppliers, and police clearance codes attached to them. Coleman steps closer to Hayes, voice barely audible now. Last warning, officer. Hayes looks at David one more time, really looks. Then at the system. Then at the disappearing timestamp that keeps correcting itself like it never wants to be questioned. And slowly, his hand moves toward his radio again. But before he can speak, the entire arrest log on his screen refreshes by itself. And David is suddenly marked as transfer order approved. Even though no one has signed it, Hayes freezes because the transfer vehicle has just arrived outside the building, and no one here ordered it. The moment the transfer van doors slide open outside the building, everything inside the apartment shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that makes everyone stop for half a second longer than they should. Officer Daniel Hayes feels it first because he knows protocol, and this isn't it. No paperwork confirmation has been finalized, no supervisory sign-off, no chain of custody log, and yet 2 federal transport officers are already stepping into the hallway like David Rick has been officially erased from the system and replaced with a shipment. Inside the room, David is still pinned, but now his breathing has changed. Slower, focused, like he's listening more than reacting. Hayes steps closer to the handheld terminal again, scanning the authorization entry. Still there! Still wrong! And now duplicated. 2 identical approved transfer entries stamped seconds apart, both using the same invalid internal override signature. Hayes whispers under his breath, almost involuntary, "This doesn't exist." Coleman hears him anyway. That's the problem. He always hears everything. "You're still looking at that screen?" Coleman asks calmly, not turning around. "Let it go, Officer Hayes." But Hayes can't, because now he recognizes something buried in the procurement audit logs, still visible on David's laptop, something that shouldn't be accessible from this network at all. Emergency equipment contracts, vendor consolidation codes, and internal routing labels tied directly to enforcement logistics, police budgets, federal procurement pipelines, and private contractors feeding both. Hayes takes a slow step back. This isn't just a wrongful arrest. It's structured, designed, and already moving without permission. Behind him, one of the transport officers steps into the room. "Prepare for transfer." David finally speaks louder, struggling slightly against the pressure still on his back. "Officer Hayes, look at the vendor ID on that contract list." Hayes hesitates. "Just 1 second. Then he looks and sees it, a vendor name he recognizes from internal briefings, but tied to something he was told never to connect to procurement audits. His face tightens, because now the question is no longer whether this arrest is legal. It's whether anyone inside this building is allowed to stop it. And Coleman finally turns his head fully toward Hayes and says quietly, "Last chance to stay out of this before you become part of it." And the transport officers step forward toward David's body. "Step back, Officer Hayes. The command isn't loud anymore. It's controlled." Final. Coleman's voice carries through the hallway like a lock clicking shut, and for a second, even the movement in the room feels like it hesitates. But Hayes doesn't move because now he's seen enough. He raises the handheld terminal slightly, showing the live system feed still updating in real time. "This transfer order was injected twice," Hayes says firmly, "from an internal IP that doesn't match any approved federal channel." One of the transport officers shifts uncomfortably. Coleman finally turns fully toward him. Not angry. Worse. Patient. "You're reading a system you were never cleared to question," Coleman replies. "That's your mistake." Hayes shakes his head once. "No," he says. "My mistake would be ignoring this." Inside the room, David is now being lifted slightly by the arresting officers. His hands are still restrained, but his voice cuts through the movement. They're moving me before the audit file sync completes, he says. That means someone is trying to delete the trail while it's still active. Hayes glances at him again. And that's when it hits. David isn't guessing. He knows, because the laptop screen still visible from the floor is actively showing live procurement routing data contracts moving between agencies in real time like a live financial bloodstream. Hayes takes a step forward instinctively. "What audit file?" he asks. David locks eyes with him. "The one exposing where federal procurement money is actually going," he says, "and who's laundering it through enforcement contracts." Silence drops. Not because no one understands. Because they do. Coleman suddenly steps in closer, lowering his voice so only Hayes can hear. "You think you're stopping a mistake," he says. "You're interfering with a controlled federal operation." Hayes looks at him sharply. "A controlled operation doesn't erase warrants before entry," he replies. For the first time, Coleman's expression tightens. Just slightly. That's the crack. That's the tell. And then the system terminal in Hayes' hand flashes red. New alert, evidence sync blocked, external override initiated. Hayes looks down, then back up, because now even the evidence of what he's seeing is being stopped from existing. And the transport officers finally tighten their grip on David's arms. "Stop the transfer." Hayes doesn't realize he said it out loud at first, but the entire room hears it. Everything freezes for half a second. Transport officers mid-step, Coleman half-turned, David still being pulled toward the hallway. And then Coleman exhales slowly, like he's been waiting for this exact moment. "You just made your decision," he says quietly. Hayes raises the terminal again, fingers moving fast now. He's no longer asking for permission. He's pulling every hidden log he can access. Internal routing, arrest initiation chain, override origin points. And what he sees finally connects everything. The arrest wasn't triggered by Patrol Command. It wasn't even triggered by Coleman. It was triggered from a procurement-linked administrative node buried inside federal vendor authorization systems. Meaning, this wasn't a police operation. It was a coordinated removal. Hayes looks up sharply. "You're not arresting him," he says. "You're extracting him before audit completion." David, still restrained, turns his head slightly toward Hayes. "That's exactly what it is," he says. "They can't let the full procurement chain finalize. If it does, every linked contract gets exposed." One of the transport officers hesitates, just barely. Coleman notices immediately. "Move him," Coleman snaps. But Hayes steps forward now, fully blocking the exit. And this is where everything shifts. Because Hayes activates his body cam archive sync, the hidden layer used only for internal corruption review, and forces it into live broadcast mode. Coleman's eyes narrow instantly. "Shut that down," he orders. But it's too late. The system begins streaming. Not just the arrest. Everything. The pre-logged warrant timestamp. The internal override injection. The procurement audit files on David's laptop. All of it. In real time. Coleman takes one step forward, voice dropping dangerously low. "You don't understand what you've just exposed." Hayes doesn't look away. "I understand enough," he says. And then the building alarm tone changes. Not a fire alarm. Not security. A system-wide administrative lockdown signal. Meaning someone somewhere above them just saw the broadcast and approved a response. The hallway lights flicker once, then stabilize. And David is suddenly pulled harder toward the exit as backup officers arrive at the end of the corridor. Coleman leans in one last time toward Hayes. "This is bigger than you think," he says. Hayes looks at him, and for the first time, his voice is steady. Then I guess it's time it stopped being hidden. And as David is dragged through the doorway toward an unregistered transport corridor, the live feed glitches and cuts to black. The screen doesn't stay black for long. Hayes forces a backup stream through a secondary internal relay, and what comes through is worse than silence. It's controlled chaos. David Rick is inside the transport corridor now, not a standard exit path, not a marked federal route, a sealed internal passage that doesn't appear in public building schematics. That alone confirms everything. This was never an arrest in the legal sense. It was a removal procedure. Hayes doesn't hesitate anymore. He pushes the full archived body cam stream, procurement audit logs, and system override trail into the Federal Oversight Emergency Channel, bypassing Coleman, bypassing internal command, bypassing everything designed to contain it. And then it hits. First reaction, system freeze alerts across multiple departments. Then, audit flags triggering in procurement divisions tied to enforcement contracting. Then, a direct federal response lock manual human review engagement. Inside minutes, everything changes. David is stopped mid-transfer, not because of force, because the system above the system has finally been forced to look. Coleman's authority begins collapsing in real time. His override signature is flagged as unauthorized administrative injection. The arrest record dissolves from active status. And for the first time since the raid began, David is no longer marked as a detainee. He is marked as illegally processed. Hayes arrives at the transport corridor entrance just as backup federal compliance officers take control. David is pulled out of the sealed passage, still restrained, but now visibly aware that something has shifted. The first thing he sees is Hayes. Neither of them speaks immediately because both understand what just happened. Then David finally says it quietly. "You did it!" Hayes doesn't respond right away because the cost is already starting to show. His terminal flashes, internal whistleblower status activated, field duty suspended pending review. Across the building, Coleman is being escorted out silent, expression locked, no longer in control of anything. But the victory isn't clean. Within hours, federal procurement oversight confirms David's audit was real and explosive. Multiple contracts tied to enforcement supply chains are frozen. Investigations expand across agencies. And the illegal arrest protocol is officially documented. But as David is finally uncuffed in a secure review room, a federal officer hands him a warning notice. Your access has been restricted pending security reassessment. He reads it slowly, then looks up because he understands what that really means. Not protection, containment. Outside the building, Hayes stands alone, watching the operation continue without him now. His phone vibrates once. Unknown number. No message. Just a single file transfer request titled Response Team Review, Read Incident. And underneath it, a second line appears briefly before disappearing. Subject still active. Hayes stares at it because the case may be officially closed, but whatever David exposed was never just one arrest. And now it knows exactly who stopped it.